It is 1998, and somewhere inside a cramped dorm room at Stanford University, two graduate students are hunched over a tangle of cables and discount computer parts. The floor is barely visible. Hard drives are stacked like books nobody bothered to shelve. A crude search engine is running on borrowed university bandwidth, and it is eating so much of Stanford's network capacity that the IT department has started fielding complaints. The two students behind this chaos are Larry Page and Sergey Brin. They are not trying to build the most valuable company in the history of the internet. They are trying to finish their PhDs. Their search engine is a side project, a research experiment that keeps spiraling out of control, and they want to sell it. They want someone, anyone, to take it off their hands so they can get back to their dissertations. They approach Yahoo, the undisputed king of the internet. They offer to sell everything, the technology, the algorithm, the whole project, for $1 million. Yahoo says no. That decision would go on to become one of the most expensive mistakes in the history of business. Because the search engine those two students were trying to unload was Google, and the technology Yahoo dismissed as unnecessary would eventually devour Yahoo's entire empire and reshape civilization itself. Today, Google's parent company, Alphabet, is worth nearly $4 trillion. It processes over 8 billion searches every single day. It has become so deeply woven into the fabric of modern life that its name is literally a verb. But none of that was inevitable. Google's rise from a Stanford dorm room experiment to the dominant force on the internet is a story of obsessive engineering, a revolutionary insight about how the web actually works. A series of rejections that nearly killed the project before it started, and a handful of moments where the entire trajectory of the digital age turned on decisions made by people who had no idea what they were setting in motion. This is that story. You're watching Tech District, where we take apart the companies that built the electronic world, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. If that's your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because the rise here is just as strange as the fall. To understand why Google mattered, you first have to understand just how broken internet search was before it arrived. And broken is not an exaggeration. In the mid-1990s, the World Wide Web was exploding. Millions of pages were being created every month. Information was pouring onto the internet at a pace nobody had anticipated. But finding anything useful on this rapidly expanding web was an exercise in pure frustration. The search engines of the era, AltaVista, Lycos, Excite, InfoSeek, all worked roughly the same way. A user typed in a query, and the engine scanned its index looking for pages that contained those keywords. The more times a keyword appeared on a page, the higher that page ranked in the results. That was essentially the entire system. There was no deeper logic, no understanding of quality, no sense of which pages were genuinely authoritative and which were just stuffed with repeated words by someone gaming the system. The result was chaos. Search for a medical condition, and you might get a conspiracy blog before you got a hospital. Search for a historical figure, and the top result could be someone's abandoned fan page. Webmasters quickly figured out that they could manipulate rankings by simply repeating keywords hundreds of times, sometimes in invisible text, sometimes in the page's metadata, sometimes just brazenly plastered across the content. The engines were drowning in the very abundance they were supposed to organize, and they had no meaningful way to separate signal from noise. And then there was Yahoo. Yahoo was not really a search engine at all in the traditional sense. It was a portal, a hand-curated directory of websites, organized into categories by human editors. Think of it as a giant table of contents for the internet, maintained by an army of people who personally decided which sites deserved to be listed and where. In 1998, Yahoo was the most visited website on the planet. Its model was simple and, at the time, wildly successful. Keep users on Yahoo's own pages for as long as possible. Show them news, show them email, show them stock quotes and sports scores and shopping links. The last thing Yahoo wanted was to send people somewhere else. This philosophy, the portal model, was the dominant thinking in the internet industry. Keep eyeballs on your platform. Monetize attention. The idea that a search engine should find the best possible answer and immediately send users away seemed to Yahoo's leadership like a fundamentally flawed business strategy. They were about to learn how wrong that thinking was. Larry Page arrived at Stanford University in 1995 as a doctoral student in computer science. He came from a household that practically ran on technology. His father, Carl Page, was a computer science professor at Michigan State University. His mother, Gloria, taught computer programming. Page grew up surrounded by circuits and code, the way other kids grew up surrounded by sports equipment. At Stanford, Page needed a dissertation topic, and he became fascinated by a seemingly abstract question. What was the mathematical structure of the World Wide Web? Specifically, he wanted to understand backlinks, the web of connections formed when one page links to another. Every hyperlink, Page reasoned, was a kind of vote. When a website linked to another website, it was essentially saying, "This page matters. Go look at it." And some votes carried more weight than others. A link from a prestigious university's homepage meant something fundamentally different from a link buried on a random personal blog. It was an elegant idea, borrowed from the world of academic publishing. In academia, a research paper's importance is measured not just by its content, but by how many other papers cite it. A paper cited by 1,000 other researchers is, almost by definition, more significant than one cited by 3. Page wanted to apply the same logic to the web. This is where Sergey Brin enters the picture. Brin was born in Moscow in 1973 and emigrated to the United States as a child when his family fled the Soviet Union. Brilliant in mathematics from an early age, he earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Maryland at 19 and came to Stanford on a National Science Foundation fellowship. By most accounts, Brin and Page did not immediately get along. During a campus tour for prospective students in 1995, Brin was assigned to show Page around, and the two reportedly argued about nearly everything. They were both opinionated, both stubborn, both absolutely convinced they were right about whatever they happened to be debating. But they also recognized something in each other, a shared intellectual intensity, a compulsive need to solve problems that other people either ignored or accepted as unsolvable. Brin's mathematical brilliance complemented Page's systems-level thinking. Within months, they were collaborating. Together, they built a prototype search engine called Backrub. The name was a playful reference to its core function: analyzing backlinks. Running on cobbled-together hardware in Page's dorm room, cheap PCs, borrowed servers, hard drives salvaged from wherever they could find them, Backrub crawled the web and mapped the link structure between pages. There was also a third person involved in those early days, a fellow Stanford student named Scott Hassan, who wrote much of the original code that made Backrub functional. Hassan left before Google was officially incorporated and went on to found a robotics company called Willow Garage. His name rarely appears in the standard telling of the Google story, but the original code that powered the first version of the search engine was, by most accounts, largely his work. From this foundation, Brin and Page developed the algorithm that would change everything. They called it PageRank, a name that served as both a description of what it did and a quiet nod to Larry Page himself. PageRank did not simply count how many links pointed to a given page. It evaluated the quality of those links recursively. A page linked by many important pages became important itself, which in turn increased the importance of every page it linked to. The math was elegant. The results were astonishing. In side-by-side comparisons with every other search engine available at the time, Backrub produced dramatically better results. It consistently surfaced the most relevant, most authoritative pages at the top. Where AltaVista returned a wall of loosely related noise, Backrub returned exactly what you were looking for, usually within the first 3 results. The story everyone tells is that Brin and Page knew from the beginning they had something world-changing. The documented record is thinner, and honesty requires a flag here. What is clear from their own Stanford research paper, published in 1998, is that they understood PageRank was a fundamentally better approach to ranking web content. Whether they foresaw the scale of what it would become is another question entirely. What they did know was that the existing search engines were failing, and their approach worked. But Backrub had a problem. It was consuming enormous amounts of Stanford's computing resources. The university's network was buckling under the load. Page and Brin were using nearly half of the entire campus's internet bandwidth to power their crawler. This was not a sustainable situation, and they knew it. Page and Brin did not set out to build a company. They were academics. They wanted to finish their degrees, publish their research, and move on. So when Backrub outgrew Stanford's infrastructure, their first instinct was not to raise venture capital. It was to sell. They renamed the project Google, a playful misspelling of Google, the mathematical term, for the number 1 followed by 100 zeros. The name reflected their ambition to organize the seemingly infinite amount of information on the web. And then they went looking for a buyer. They approached Yahoo first. Yahoo, the Colossus. Yahoo, which at that moment was processing more traffic than almost any other website in existence. Page and Brin offered to sell Google, the technology, the algorithm, everything, for $1 million. Yahoo's leadership was not interested. The reasoning was straightforward and, from their perspective, entirely logical. Yahoo was a portal. Its strategy was to keep users on Yahoo's pages, not to send them elsewhere. Google's fundamental purpose, find the best answer and send the user away as fast as possible, ran directly counter to everything Yahoo was trying to do. Why would Yahoo pay $1 million for a technology that was designed to push people off its platform? Page and Brin tried other doors. They approached AltaVista. They approached Excite. They offered to sell Google to Excite's CEO, George Bell, for the same price, $1 million. Bell turned them down. Excite's venture capitalist, Vinod Khosla, even managed to negotiate the asking price down to $750,000, and Bell still said no. Think about that for a moment. The core technology that would eventually power a $4 trillion company was available for less than the price of a modest house in Silicon Valley. And nobody wanted it. These rejections are easy to mock in hindsight, but they reveal something important about how innovation actually works. The people running Yahoo and Excite and AltaVista were not stupid. They were operating within a framework, the portal model, that made perfect sense given the information they had at the time. The problem was that the framework itself was wrong. They were optimizing for a world that was about to stop existing. With no buyer in sight and Stanford's patience wearing thin, Page and Brin faced a decision. They could shut Google down and return to their dissertations. Or they could try something that neither of them had ever planned on doing. They could start a company. The turning point came on the porch of Stanford professor David Cheriton's house. Cheriton had invited a friend, Andy Bechtolsheim, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, to meet 2 of his students who had built something interesting. Page and Brin gave Bechtolsheim a demonstration of Google. The demo lasted about 15 minutes. Bechtolsheim grasped the significance immediately. He understood PageRank intuitively, because it mirrored a concept he already knew from academic publishing, the idea that citations measure importance. He saw the business model too. Sponsored links, relevant ads, 5 cents a click. He did the math in his head. 1 million searches a day, even at that tiny rate per click, meant the economics were sound. "I don't want to waste time," Bechtolsheim reportedly said. "I'm sure it'll work out." He walked to his car and came back with a check for $100,000 made out to Google Inc., a company that did not yet legally exist. David Cheriton wrote a matching check for another $100,000 moments later. Page and Brin now had $200,000 in funding for a company they had not yet incorporated. They couldn't even cash the checks until they filed the paperwork. On September 4, 1998, Larry Page and Sergey Brin officially incorporated Google Inc. They rented a garage in Menlo Park, California. from a woman named Susan Wojcicki, paying $1,700 a month. Wojcicki would later become Google's 16th employee and eventually the CEO of YouTube. The garage had a ping pong table, bright blue carpet, and clunky desktop computers stacked everywhere. It looked like exactly what it was, two 25-year-olds winging it. Google was born, but survival was far from guaranteed. What happened next is a masterclass in compounding advantage. Google's search results were simply, demonstrably better than everything else available. Users who tried it once rarely went back to Alta Vista or Excite. The clean, uncluttered homepage, just a logo, a search bar, and two buttons, was a radical departure from the cluttered portal pages of the competition. While Yahoo's homepage screamed at users with dozens of links, ads, and categories, Google whispered. It said, "Tell us what you need and we will find it." Word spread organically, and it spread fast. By 1999, Google was processing 500,000 queries a day. By 2000, that number had exploded to 100 million. Stanford's own search function began redirecting to Google. Tech journalists started writing about it. PC Magazine named Google its search engine of choice. Users who had spent years wrestling with inferior search tools suddenly found something that actually worked, and they told everyone they knew. The buzz was building, and it was building with an intensity that caught even Brin and Page off guard. In June 1999, Google secured a $25 million funding round from two of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital firms, Kleiner Perkins Caufield and Byers and Sequoia Capital. This was an extraordinary endorsement. These were firms that had backed Amazon, Cisco, and Apple. Their involvement signaled to the entire industry that Google was not a toy. It was a contender. But the company still had a critical problem. It had no revenue model. Google was burning through its funding while giving away its core product for free. The dot-com bubble was inflating all around them, and companies with far less substance were raising billions on nothing but promises. Page and Brin, to their credit, were obsessively focused on the product. They believed that if the search results were good enough, the money would eventually follow. They were right, but the mechanism that proved them right was something few people anticipated. In October 2000, Google launched AdWords. The concept was deceptively simple. Advertisers could bid on specific keywords and place small text ads alongside relevant search results. A user searching for running shoes would see ads from shoe companies. A user searching for tax preparation would see ads from accounting firms. The ads were targeted, relevant, and unobtrusive. They did not interrupt the user experience. They enhanced it. This was the business model that would generate hundreds of billions of dollars. AdWords was not just an advertising platform. It was a revolution in how businesses connected with customers. For the first time, companies could reach people at the exact moment they were actively looking for a specific product or service. The economics were ruthlessly efficient. Advertisers only paid when someone actually clicked on their ad. Google only showed ads that were relevant to the search. Everyone got what they wanted. The revenue numbers tell the story of what happened next. In 2001, Google generated $86 million. In 2002, $440 million. In 2003, $1.5 billion. The growth was not linear, it was exponential. And it was powered by a flywheel that only spun faster. Better search results attracted more users. More users attracted more advertisers. More advertising revenue funded better infrastructure and engineering talent, which produced even better search results. Meanwhile, Yahoo was watching all of this unfold with growing alarm. In a twist that borders on comedy, Yahoo had actually started licensing Google's search technology in 2000, paying roughly $7 million a year to use the very product it had refused to buy outright for $1 million just 2 years earlier. Every time a Yahoo user ran a search, the results were powered by Google. Yahoo was effectively training its own users to prefer a competitor's technology. By 2002, Yahoo's leadership finally understood the magnitude of their mistake. CEO Terry Semel approached Brin and Page about acquiring Google. This time, it was Google that held the cards. Brin and Page initially suggested a price of $1 billion. Semel agreed. But then, as negotiations progressed, Google's founders raised the price to $3 billion. Semel balked. The deal collapsed. It was Yahoo's second chance to own Google, and it was Yahoo's second refusal. On August 19, 2004, Google held its initial public offering on the NASDAQ exchange. The company priced its shares at $85 each, actually below the initial expected range, and raised $1.67 billion. The IPO valued Google at $23 billion. On its first day of trading, the stock rose 18%. The IPO was a watershed moment, not just for Google, but for the entire technology industry. The dot-com crash of 2000 and 2001 had left the tech sector reeling. Investors were burned. Skepticism was everywhere. Google's successful debut, backed by actual revenue, actual profits, and a proven business model, helped restore confidence that technology companies could be built on substance rather than speculation. Page and Brin, both 31 years old at the time of the IPO, became billionaires overnight. So did several early employees. Andy Bechtolsheim's original $100,000 check was now worth several $billion. Susan Wojcicki's garage had become the most famous rental property in Silicon Valley history. 6 years earlier, 2 graduate students had tried to sell this technology for the price of a used car. Now, it was worth more than most countries' annual economic output. But the IPO was just the beginning. Google was about to transform from a search engine into something far more ambitious. In the years following the IPO, Google launched Gmail, Google Maps, Google Earth, and Google News. It acquired a small video sharing startup called YouTube in 2006 for $1.65 billion, a purchase that seemed extravagant at the time, but would prove to be one of the shrewdest acquisitions in corporate history. It developed the Android operating system, which would go on to power the vast majority of the world's smartphones. It built Chrome, which became the dominant web browser. It invested in artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, cloud computing, and quantum research. In 2015, the company restructured under a new parent entity called Alphabet, reflecting the reality that Google had become far more than a search engine. It was a technology conglomerate, a research laboratory, and an advertising juggernaut all at once. It is tempting to reduce Google's impact to a list of products and acquisitions. But the deeper legacy is something more fundamental. Google changed how human beings relate to information itself. Before Google, finding an answer to a question required effort, a trip to a library, a phone call to an expert, a flip through an encyclopedia. After Google, the answer was a few keystrokes away. This shift was so complete, so total, that an entire generation has grown up unable to imagine a world where you could not simply search for anything you wanted to know at any time, from anywhere. The phrase, "just Google it," became universal. The company's name entered the dictionary as a verb. No other technology company in history has achieved that particular form of cultural saturation. People do not Apple things. They do not Microsoft a question. But they Google everything. Google also fundamentally reshaped the economics of the internet. The advertising model it pioneered, targeted, keyword-based, pay-per-click, became the financial engine that powered the entire digital economy. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and countless other platforms adopted variations of the same basic approach. Google did not just build a successful company. It created the business model that the modern internet runs on. And then there is the question of what happened to Yahoo. The company that turned down Google for $1 million spent the next 2 decades in a slow, painful decline. It missed opportunity after opportunity. It turned down a $44.6 billion acquisition offer from Microsoft in 2008. It cycled through CEOs. It sold its core business to Verizon in 2017 for $4.48 billion, less than the price Google had asked for in 2002. The brand that once defined the internet became a cautionary tale in business schools around the world. The contrast between Google and Yahoo is not just a story about technology. It is a story about vision, about two fundamentally different theories of what the internet was for. Yahoo saw the internet as a destination, a place where users should stay, browse, and consume. Google saw the internet as a tool, something that should help users find what they need and get out of the way as quickly as possible. Yahoo optimized for time spent on its platform. Google optimized for the speed and accuracy of its answers. Both philosophies were internally coherent. Both had intelligent people defending them. But only one of them correctly understood what people actually wanted from the internet. There is a detail about Google's origin story that does not get enough attention. When Andy Bechtolsheim wrote that $100,000 check on David Sheridan's porch, he made it out to Google Inc., a company that did not yet exist. Page and Brin literally could not deposit the check. They had to go incorporate the company first, just so they could open a bank account. That detail captures something essential about how transformative things actually begin. Not with grand plans. Not with corporate strategy documents. Not with a clear vision of a $4 trillion empire. They begin with a check written to a company that does not exist yet, by a man who watched a 15-minute demo and said, "I'm sure it'll work out." Larry Page and Sergey Brin did not set out to build the most important company on the internet. They set out to write a better dissertation. They stumbled onto a fundamental insight about how the web worked, that links were votes and votes could be counted, and they followed that insight wherever it led, even when it led them away from the academic careers they had planned for themselves. They tried to sell their creation. Nobody wanted it, so they built it themselves. And in building it, they reshaped how billions of people access knowledge, navigate the world, communicate with each other, and understand reality itself. The next time you type a question into that clean white search bar, the one with the multicolored logo that has become as familiar as a street sign, remember that it almost did not exist. Remember that the technology behind it was once offered to Yahoo for the price of a mid-range luxury car. Remember that the two people who created it wanted nothing more than to go back to school. Some of the most transformative things in history started not with ambition, but with curiosity. Not with a business plan, but with a question nobody else thought to ask. Google did not begin as a company. It began as a question. What if the structure of the web itself could tell you what mattered? 28 years later, the whole world is still typing questions into the answer. If you ever used Yahoo, AltaVista, or any of the old search engines before Google took over, drop a comment below. Tell us which one you used, what year, and whether you remember the moment you first tried Google. The people who lived through that transition know more about what was lost and what was gained than the people who sold it. We have the story of another American tech empire coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.